Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the channel. In this video, I am going to be making a breakdown, basically, of each of the different classes in Dungeonborne. So there's a lot of classes here, including the new Druid, which is completely new to this open beta, which is very exciting. But this video is basically going to be, kind of telling you what kind of play style you'd want to be using for each of the different classes and kind of just what the classes do, really. So first up, there's the Fighter. The Fighter is the very, very versatile class. They can use pretty much anything, as you can see here, and their main downside is they've got a slow base movement speed, and normally the classes that have slower movement speeds are also pretty tanky, as you can see in the pros section. So they're tanky, and they're versatile. So this is basically who you're going to pick if you don't know what other class you would want to play. This would be like the good class to start off with, get a feel for the game, get a feel for, going into the dungeon and fighting some enemies, and then you'd probably end up picking someone else, but this is also like a solid class to finish with or to like stick to as well. But for the most part, it's going to be like the all-round, well-rounded, versatile class that you can just kind of pick up and play to get a basic understanding of the game. And then after that, it would probably require some further testing, but this would be kind of more of a tank in its core. So, its first ability, Whirlwind, swings weapon and spins while moving, so while you're spinning you can move around, dealing multiple instances of damage to surrounding enemies, and it does require a two-hand weapon. So you basically swing around in a circle and you can move a little bit while you're swinging around in a circle, and it damages enemies multiple times. Their second ability is Charge. It quickly charges forwards a short distance, and using this ability will not interrupt actions currently being performed. So two very, very basic skills there. There's really not a whole lot to them. I'm not too sure if I'm getting into... I'm not too sure if I'm going to go into the passive skills, but do note that these passive skills don't kick in straight away for any of the classes. You kind of have to reach certain requirements to activate these passive skills. So do just be aware of that, and because that's a little bit more complicated, I'm not going to be going into those in this video. Instead, I'm just going to move on over to the Priest. So, the Priest is basically like the Cleric or the Healer or the Support class. They have healing abilities, so they can heal allies and buff allies, but they don't do much damage, and they are weak at melee ranges. They can use one-handed swords, one-handed maces, staffs, and orbs. So their first skill, Divine Guidance, channels the power of the Holy Light to summon an oracle at the designated location. After a brief delay, it heals friendly targets and deals active holy damage to enemy targets within the area. The healing effect is influenced by your damage attribute and has a chance to critical strike. It requires a staff or orb. So this is basically an AoE that after a short delay, it will heal your teammates and it will deal damage to the enemy. So it's kind of like you can heal your teammates with it or you can damage enemies with it. It does do both. The second ability is Divine Protection. Apply a Divine Shield to a friendly target, making them immune to all damage for 3 seconds. If no target is selected, then you apply it to yourself. So if you're playing solo and you use this, it's just going to use it on yourself. But immune to all damage for 3 seconds is pretty powerful, and obviously this is just a buff. And again, I'm not going to be going into the passive skills, so we're going to go onto the Rogue. So the Rogue is the stealthy, sneaky boy that you basically want to hide in the shadows and take enemy by surprise, use the element of surprise. Not much health, but can dish out lots of damage very quickly. They'd be kind of similar to the DPS, right? You don't want to be in prolonged melee combat, but you do want to get up close to the enemies and mess them up a little bit and then get out of there. So they have high base movement speed, high base interaction speed, quick entry and exit of combat, and invisibility. They're squishy, so they don't have much health, and they're weak in prolonged melee combat. They can use one-handed swords, crossbows, and daggers. Their first ability is petrifying poison. It coats the melee weapon with poison. The next successful attack will cause the target to be petrified. Petrified targets cannot act and have their damage taken reduced by 100%. Their effect is removed when the target is attacked. So basically what this does is you use this, and your next attack on the enemy will make the enemy just freeze. So they'll just be frozen in position, they can't do anything for a couple of seconds, and if you attack them, it doesn't do any damage to them, and then they're not frozen anymore. So basically, if you're playing in teams, this is going to be useful for just like making it so that one of the enemies can't do anything for the fight, and then maybe you go get a pick on someone else. Or if you're playing solos, you can just use this on an enemy to like open a chest or just get out of the area if you want to. Obviously, you can also just use it on like normal enemies as well, and not just other players, to just freeze them if you don't want to deal with them. And then you also have Vanish, where you enter stealth for 15 seconds and critical damage is increased while in stealth. So that's their two abilities. So, the Pyromancer. This is the mage, and instead of having like sorcery or stuff like that, you just use fire, but this is going to be like a mage build. So they have ranged burst damage and AoE damage, as well as magic weapon specialization, because obviously they're a fire person. They have a slow base movement speed, and they need specific environments to deal high damage. They use one-handed swords, daggers, staffs, and orbs. So they have Pyroblast. The fireball can be charged up to 2 stages. In stage 1, you shoot 3 tracking fireballs at the target, each dealing a small amount of fire damage. In stage 2, you launch a large fireball that deals a large amount of fire damage in an area at the point of impact. Upon completing stage 2's charge, gain the ability to levitate by pressing the spacebar while airborne. So you can charge this up, or you can just release it straight away. If you release it straight away, it's going to be weaker, and it's going to shoot 3 tracking fireballs at the target, each dealing a small amount of damage. And if you charge it up and hold it down, then you can launch a larger fireball that deals more damage, and also you can levitate while you're charging that if you hold down the spacebar. So it's a pretty cool ability, and it's fairly straightforward. Your second ability is Fire Blast. You shoot out a ring-shaped fire shockwave, knocking back surrounding enemies and dealing a small amount of fire damage, and greatly slowing them for a brief duration. Can be used during any action without interrupting the current action. So basically, because you're quite slow, you're going to be using this ability to knock the enemies back and try and get away from them, really, because you don't want to be super up close to the enemies, you want to be fairly far away. So you're going to use this to like make them go away, and for you to try and get out of this whatever bad situation you're in, really. That's what you're going to be using this for. Now, the Death Knight, one of the undead classes. It is worth noting that all of the human classes, which is the 4 classes I've gone over so far, they have extra inventory space and they can carry more loot. And then the undead classes have soul energy, and they replenish it by killing creatures and absorbing their souls. So do just be aware of that. Humans have certain abilities, and there is also an elf, but I guess we'll get to that in a minute. So, this is basically another tank. So, this Death Knight class is kind of complicated. They can do lots of melee damage, and I know they kind of look like a tank, but they're not exactly a tank. They're kind of a cross between a tank and a mage, so they're kind of, you know, they can do alright in a 1v1 situation, but also you want to be using your other abilities to allow them to survive, I would say. So they have the initiative advantage, and that is because one of the abilities. They have melee AoE damage, which is pretty handy, and they're capable in melee combat. They rely on soul energy. They have weak survival skills, rather, and low sustainability. So this is kind of like a really weird tank, I think is the best way to describe this class. They can use one-handed swords, two-handed swords, crossbows, shields, and one-handed maces, so there's a fair few options there. And their first ability is Soul Shroud. You summon evil spirits to surround yourself. While the skill is active, all enemy targets near you are slowed, and then it deals shadow damage to the surrounding area. The damage is further influenced by your strength, intelligence, and will attributes. So basically, you activate it, everyone around you is slowed, and then you deal shadow damage to the surrounding area. So it's basically like a debuff for the enemies, and then also an AoE, all in one ability. Grasp of the Grave is a lot simpler. You fire a spectral hand at the target, dealing a very small amount of shadow damage and pulling the target to you. Friendly targets are immune to the damage. You recover a small amount of soul energy if it hits an enemy target. So basically, you use this, you pull an enemy or another player towards you. So you can pull an ally towards you if they're in a bad position, or you can pull an enemy to you to basically get them away from your team and maybe pull them into a situation where it's like a 3-on-1. The Cryomancer is also undead. They have ranged AoE crowd control, strong survival skills, and high sustainability. They require sustained casting, and they have low burst damage. Their weapons of choice are one-handed swords, daggers, staffs, and orbs. So their first ability is Ice Storm. Guide a moving small-scale ice storm that can be moved by clicking on the ground, dealing a small amount of passive damage and slowing enemies. When the channeling is complete, the ice storm stops moving and unleashes a blizzard at its location, dealing active damage and continuously slowing enemies within it. So this slows down enemies, and it also damages them. It damages them over time, rather. So it's basically just like an AoE. And then you have Frost Barrier. Encase yourself in a Frost Barrier. During this time, you will not take damage and will continuously restore life. Using the skill while channeling Ice Storm will not interrupt the casting. The Cryomancer can remove the barrier at any time. So if you have ever played Mei in Overwatch, this is going to be very similar to that. You just encase yourself in a block of ice and you heal over time while that's happening, and you don't take any damage while you're inside of the ice. So a good way to pair both of these abilities is to use the Ice Storm kind of around yourself, and then so you don't take damage from that, use the Frost Barrier so you're damaging the enemies around you, but you're safe. That would just be an idea of how you could pair these two things together. So then we have the Sword Master. This is basically going to be a class that can do well up close, but they're also going to focus on being far away quite a lot. So they're strong in ranged burst damage, they have effective ranged control, they're capable in melee combat, they rely heavily on skills, and they are resource intensive. They're resource intensive because you need a lot of swords in your inventory to fire at the enemies. They use one-handed swords, two-handed swords, crossbows, and shields. So their first ability is Psionic Blades. The Swordmaster summons up to 4 swords from the sword slots to track enemies. So they just have an extra 4 sword slots in their inventory that just stores swords for you. So the Swordmaster summons up to 4 swords from the sword slots to track enemies, dealing damage and restoring a small amount of life to the Swordmaster. So for every sword that hits, you restore a small amount of HP. The skill's cooldown is determined by the number of swords shot out. Using uncommon or higher rarity swords will increase the damage. So this sounds a little bit complicated, but it's actually very, very straightforward. You put swords into your sword slots, which are in your inventory, and then you use this ability and shoot the swords out, and this deals very, very high amounts of burst damage if all 4 of the swords hit, and you can also use this to heal yourself. Their second ability is Whirling Blade. The Swordmasters summon 1 sword from the sword slots to continuously orbit around themselves for 8 seconds, dealing a small amount of damage to nearby enemies during this period. So it just goes around you in a couple of circles for 8 seconds. So you're going to want to be using this ability when someone is up close to you. So you're going to pop this just to deal a little bit more damage to them when they're around you. And this is an elf class, by the way, so elves can enter stealth by crouching and staying still, slowly recovering life, which is hugely beneficial. So you can just regenerate health over time if you are an elf. Then we come to the Druid. The Druid is completely new, introduced, 20 minutes ago? That's when the open beta went live. So this is our first look at the Druid here. So Druids are spellcasters who harness the power of nature. They can summon Trents to attack enemies or transform into a swift panther to pursue foes or withdraw from combat. So this would be a shape-shifting class. They have short-term, high mobility. They have summons to assist in combat. They're flexible tactics for long and close range. They're reliant on energy, sustained damage output, and they are fragile. Their weapon of choice is daggers, one-handed maces, staffs, and orbs. So this class is going to be the most complex class in the game. But if you can manage to use this class well and understand how it really works, you're going to be able to dish out very, very high amounts of damage very, very quickly. Their first ability is Primal Awakening. You transform into Panther form, which requires a weapon equipped. It removes all debuffs upon transformation. While in Panther form, Force of Nature is replaced with Shadow Assault. Activate again to revert to human form. So you have 4 skills here because in each state you have 2 different skills. So Force of Nature, which is referenced in this ability, is here. Summon a Trent at the designated location, lasting for 30 seconds. The Trent will attack nearby enemies and grant a shield to the Druid. When the Druid hits an enemy within the Trent's attack range using Shadow Assault, the Trent will immediately start attacking the enemy. So it's a little bit complicated, but basically you summon an enemy to attack the opponents that's going to be on your side. And then when you hit an enemy with the Trent's attack range using a different ability called Shadow Assault, then the Trent will immediately start attacking the enemy. A very basic skill here, but it's called Revert, and this is where you revert to human form. And then Shadow Assault consumes primal energy to pounce forward, dealing shadow damage to nearby enemies upon landing. Basic attacks and Shadow Assault in Panther form restore primal energy when they deal damage to enemies. So I know this all sounds very complicated, and that's because it kind of is. They're the only class that has more than 2 abilities, and that's because this class is going to have like a very, very, very high skill ceiling. So I know this probably sounds complicated. I'm not too sure I can explain it much better than that without doing a dedicated video on it, and I don't want to spend too long on this video, so I think I will just end it there. Do note that there are passive skills as well for each of the classes, but again, I'm not getting into that right now because they're a little bit more complicated and I don't want this video to go on for too long. So, if you like being a tank and just being tanky and kind of using different weapons as you come across them, you should probably go for the fighter. If you like being the support class and healing your teammates and giving the buffs, you should probably pick the priest. If you like having very, very high amounts of burst damage, and if you like being stealthy and taking the enemy by surprise and using kind of the environment to your advantage, I would go for the rogue. If you like casting spells and staying far away from your enemies at a safe distance, I would go for the Pyromancer. If you like bringing your enemy out of position and then kind of 1v1ing them away from the rest of the team, I would go for the Death Knight. If you like being able to combo abilities quite well and being able to heal yourself while managing your mana or FP, I'm not actually sure what it's called, then you should probably go for the Cryomancer. And if you like staying at ranged while also having chances of fighting people up close, then you should probably go for the Swordmaster. And if you're a very, very, very good player that really, really knows what they're doing, and you want to be able to be as good as possible in this game in like any given situation, then I do think it would require a lot of work, but the Druid is probably going to be for you. Thank you so much for watching, ladies and gentlemen. That is going to be it for this video. If you liked it, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Farewell.